Alright. Settle down, initiates. For those of you who perhaps missed our last lesson, I am Proctor Mathias of the Order of the Quill. Elder Reynolds has ordered that I continue with your education henceforth, which means we will be seeing much more of one another. I hope you are prepared. I demand a rigorous course of study from my students. Anything less would be unbefitting of the Brotherhood. Now, when last we left off, we had finished covering the pre-war world. We talked about the progress of society in the wake of World War II and the unwinding of that progress under the stress of rampant resource consumption, internal competition, and, at last, nuclear war. We spoke about the Pan-Immunity Virion Project and how it eventually evolved into the forced evolutionary virus. We shall pick up directly where we left off, on October 23rd, 2077. That date will forever live in infamy in the annals of human history. It was the day the bombs fell, the day the Great War at last spilled over the planet in a radioactive fire. The Holocaust was almost totally complete. No one is quite sure who exactly fired the first shot, but the world's nations emptied their nuclear arsenals and thousands of bombs fell across the world. Salt Lake City was struck by no less than 13 warheads. Other areas were hit with even more. Fires raged in urban cities for weeks afterwards. The vats that contained the FEV at West Tech were broken open, and the mutagenic virus spilled out into the atmosphere, where it reacted to the radiation that now suffused nearly the entire planet. Mass mutations were instant and persistent. Entirely new forms of life blossomed overnight. To truly understand the course of the events to follow the Great War, we must first go back a few days prior to that horrible calamity. In the week before the Great War, our illustrious founder, Roger Maxson, was stationed as a captain at Mariposa Military Base, the site of the FEV's creation. We will go into the events of that week in a future lesson when we more closely examine the history of our own Brotherhood, but for the purposes of this world history lesson, you should only know that Roger Maxson discovered the truth about the FEV and the human experiments that were contributing to its development. He killed his commanding officer, arrested and interrogated the scientists working on the project, and seized control of Mariposa. On October 20th, 2077, he broadcasted a declaration of rebellion across United States military channels, claiming that the government had betrayed the people. There was no response. By then, the United States was coming apart at the seams, and just 3 days later, the Great War began, and the Great War ended. Captain Maxson, his men, and their families were sheltered from the worst of the fallout within Mariposa, but Captain Maxson worried that the Chinese would soon launch a second salvo that was sure to have Mariposa in its crosshairs. He ordered his men to pack up their families, and on October 27th, they set out for a government bunker that was sequestered in an area known as Lost Hills, our mythical seat of founding. This journey from Mariposa to Lost Hills became known as the Exodus, and it left nearly a third of Maxson's group dead along the way, including his own wife. But Maxson's unit did reach Lost Hills at last, and they were able to shelter inside. Once within, Captain Maxson used the government communications equipment of the bunker to broadcast to every U.S. military unit. He again claimed that the government had failed, and that it now lay on the shoulders of those who were left to rebuild. He claimed that the future was in need of a new way, a brotherhood of steel capable of protecting those beneath its wings. Several military units across the military joined with Maxson's cause, including the famous Taggarty's Thunder, a battle-hardened U.S. Army Ranger company under the command of Elizabeth Taggarty. Taggarty's Thunder was stationed in the Appalachia region of the East Coast, and she assumed the rank of Paladin in command of Brotherhood forces there. Meanwhile, the world continued to die. Many people think of the apocalypse as a thing that came and went with the Great War, but the truth is that it was a thing that played out over many years. Indeed, in some ways, it still plays out today. Black rain fell in the weeks after the bomb, a terrible, poisonous bath that ensured radiation was spread nearly everywhere into the water table. The winter of 2078 was one of the worst in human history, with temperatures so low that survivors died en masse. The FEV seeped into everything, killing most forms of life and mutating those that remained, even the plants. The world turned into a gray, dead wasteland when it should have bloomed again without the interference of man. Terrible, ruinous creatures stalked the land. By 2080, the planet Earth was utterly unrecognizable, completely different to the world we had once known. And yet, even in the radioactive ruins, life found a way to cling on, to move forward. On the west coast, the Brotherhood consolidated itself in Lost Hills under the leadership of the first High Elder, Maxon. Elder Maxon saw that the more time passed, the more people forgot things like medicine and engineering. He worried that without action, humanity would lose such knowledge for generations. This is when our glorious mission first truly began. Elder Maxon decreed that the Brotherhood must collect technology in order to preserve it. He wanted it kept safe from those who did not understand it, studied so that its secrets were never lost, and then used in order to protect those who could not protect themselves. The area around the Lost Hills bunker fell under Brotherhood protection, and the settlers of the region soon took to calling it Maxon in honor of their protector. The city of Necropolis was founded shortly after the Great War, around the remains of Vault 12. The Vault projects were a horrific crime against humanity, but it is one you are not yet prepared to learn about in full. For now, it is enough to know that Vault 12 was designed to never seal completely, and as a result, it was flooded with radiation in the days after the war. Those who did not die were turned into ghouls, and by the year 2080 they had grouped together into a cohesive society. The former city of Bakersville was renamed Necropolis in 2083, and a ghoul by the name of Set rose to power, dominating the city in an authoritarian fist of iron. On the East Coast, the Appalachia region, centered around the Shenandoah River Valley, remained sheltered by the mountains from the worst of the radiation. A large number of survivors initially populated the region, including a group known as the Appalachian Free States. The Free States were a rebel group which existed prior to the war. They had grown suspicious of the government, their ties to Vault-Tec, and they had taken to the mountains in order to build bunkers to survive on their own. Their forethought paid off, and in the aftermath of the Great War, the Free States found themselves in de facto control of the region. They organized survivors together, along with an emerging group known as the Responders. The Responders were former first responders, firefighters, police officers, paramedics, who banded together to take care of people in the wake of the Great War. These groups, combined with Paladin Taggarty's chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel, ensured that the region remained somewhat better off than much of the rest of the world, even with Washington, D.C. only a short distance away. Even so, they were not without their setbacks. Vaults in Appalachia were some of the first scheduled to unseal their doors, and they began to do so with Vault 94 in 2078. Vault 94 contained a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, an advanced piece of technology that was capable of terraforming the region back into fertility. However, a misunderstanding between the Free States and the residents of Vault 94 led to the GECK malfunctioning and running rampant through the region. It created a fetid swamp that was overrun by towering fungi, an area that the locals came to call the Mire. Then, in 2082, a feud between a local raider group known as the Cutthroats and the Free States led to the destruction of the Summersville Dam. Charleston, West Virginia was left a destroyed, flooded mess, and thousands were killed. Things only grew worse over time. Survivors in Appalachia began to report sightings of strange, bat-like creatures towards the end of 2085, and then, in 2086, Harper's Ferry came under attack from a terrible plague, a disease that took over those infected and turned them into shambling, fungus-ridden creatures known as the Scorched. The Scorched were driven mad by the fungus that piloted them, and they were bound together by a diabolical, telepathic creature known as the Scorched Queen. The bat-like creatures that survivors had been sighting were scorched beasts, terrible monstrosities driven by the Scorched Queen's will. Harper's Ferry quickly fell, and all of Appalachia came under assault as the Scorched plague spread like wildfire. unmaintained satellites began to drop out of orbit, cutting off communications between Paladin Taggarty's chapter and the rest of our Brotherhood, which meant that High Elder Maxon had no idea what was unfolding in the Shenandoah River Valley. Meanwhile, back on the West Coast, more vaults began to open. Vault 8 opened in 2091. Vault 8 was a control vault, meaning that the residents within were true survivors that were expected to recolonize the surface. They utilized their Gek to restore fertility to the land around the vault's entrance, and they founded Vault City, a thriving settlement that stood apart from the rest of the wasteland. The vault beneath Los Angeles opened in 2092, and the survivors founded several settlements across the ruined urban wasteland of Old LA. This area became known as the Boneyard for the skeletal remains of buildings that dominated the skyline. In 2093, another thriving settlement named The Hub was founded around a small oasis in the desert by a man named Angus. The Hub served as a perfect nexus for trader caravans, and it quickly grew to house several merchant families capable of taking goods across the wasteland. Yet, even as life struggled to reestablish itself, threats continued to emerge. The FEV vats at Mariposa Military Base remained, and from their foul depths emerged abominable mutant after abominable mutant. Mutant attacks on trader caravans grew more and more common, until it became a dire necessity to hire proper protection if a trader expected to make it across the wasteland. There are conflicting records as to whether or not a town was present, but we are certain that there were at least some survivors living in the area that would become Shady Sands by 2097. Many of them struggled to come to terms with the new status quo. Raiders became as common as the mutants, and great raider clans began to form and harry the settlements of survivors. These clans, groups like the Khans, the Vipers, the Jackals, terrorized the entire wasteland. Back east, the Free States and the Appalachian chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel struggled to hold back the Scorched Plague. Paladin Taggarty was slain in battle against the Scorched Queen in 2095, and the rest of the chapter was slain by the end of that year. Make no mistake. Paladin Taggarty's knights fought to the last man, and they took many of the Scorched with them. The Brotherhood has not forgotten their deeds. Their names will forever live on. The Responders and the Free States continued the fight without our aid, but the struggle became a losing battle. The Responders were completely overwhelmed by the end of 2096. What remained of the Free States were swept away soon after. Survivors fled Appalachia en masse, and the region, once one of the more protected left on Earth, became a haunted, desolate place, only the purview of ghosts and echoes. It would remain so for nearly a decade when, in 2102, Vault 76 opened. Vault 76 was yet another control vault, and the residents re-emerged onto the surface under the auspices of Reclamation Day. They returned to the light, prepared to rebuild the world, only to find Appalachia overrun by an incurable, violent plague. These tenacious survivors managed to develop a cure to the Scorched Plague, and then they developed a plan in order to deal with the Scorched Queen. They broke into several of the unused nuclear silos hidden throughout Appalachia and used the missiles to draw out the Queen. Then, together, they managed to slay the beast, thus ending the threat of the Scorched for good. Survivors were able to return to Appalachia, and they slowly trickled back into the region over the course of the next year. This included the 1st Expeditionary Force, a unit of Brotherhood Knights under the command of Paladin Romani. Paladin Romani had been dispatched to reinforce the Appalachian Brotherhood. They arrived in the region in 2103, only to find that the Brotherhood was completely wiped out. Paladin Romani's forces seized Fort Defiance and re-established operations in the area. Her chapter of the Brotherhood, however, came under assault by super mutants the following year, and the Brotherhood in turn aimed its goals towards defeating this menace. Elsewhere, on the East Coast, other groups of survivors struggled to hold on. The Pit, the former city of Pittsburgh, played host to a band of survivors who refused to leave their home. The city was a toxic, polluted wasteland where the very air was a poison, and yet they fought hard to try to drive back the endless wave of mutants and raiders in order to restart the furnaces of industry that Pittsburgh once played host to. Other survivors fought to find a life in Atlantic City, in Boston, in Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. The Blue Ridge Caravan Company was able to expand out from Appalachia until it had caravans traveling up and down the East Coast. We have obtained records in recent years that indicate the Institute, that pernicious enemy that we have recently defeated, was founded in 2110 out of the band of survivors who used to work and teach at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, one of the premier educational institutions of the pre-war world. The Institute began to create robotic beings they called synths, and at first they attempted to work with the people of Boston in order to rebuild. Mutual mistrust quickly ended that relationship, however, and the Institute faded into the background, a boogeyman that many came to believe did not even truly exist. Mutant and raider attacks only continued to grow worse in the West. In 2102, things got so bad that a merchant by the name of Harold finally decided to do something about it. He hired a team of mercenaries and adventurers, including the mysterious Dr. Richard Gray, to backtrack the mutants to Mariposa military base. The group was attacked outside the base and scattered. Richard Gray was tossed into one of the vats of FEV that were hidden there. He was mutated and perverted into a terrible new form of life, an intelligent and powerful telepathic creature that was able to dominate other mutated forms of life. Gray took to calling himself the Master, and he began to experiment with the FEV, hoping to breed an army of mutants that would allow him to overrun the world. It took Gray time to acclimate to his condition, and to gather the materials he needed to create his forces. Slowly, individual adventurers began to wander into Mariposa, where they were consumed by the Master. The Master grew smarter and smarter. He began to send out raiding parties to collect human subjects for his experimentation, but the work was slow. He would return to plague the wasteland decades later, though that is the subject for another lesson. Indeed, this is likely a good place for us to stop for the day, in the year 2105. The first few decades after the Great War were a turbulent time, filled with uncertainty and given over to the reign of terrible, inhuman monsters. Very few groups managed to maintain a veneer of civilization, and even fewer managed to survive the way our Brotherhood has managed to survive. Yet, despite the constant struggle over things like clean water, safety, and food, the indomitable force of human nature refused to be cowed. Many fought to protect those who remain, not only knights and paladins of our order, but also locals who would simply not be cowed. Society began to reform in fits and starts, suffering setback after setback, and yet refusing to be truly erased. It is this unquenchable drive that the Brotherhood seeks to control, to steer towards a common good that works for all. But we will discuss that more in detail during our next lesson. For now, proceed to the next point on your daily schedule. When next we meet, we will discuss Governor Angus of the Hub, the Merchant Wars, Diamond City, and Shady Sands. We are far from done with world history, and I expect you all to study what you have learned here today. Dismissed, initiates. Ad Victorum.